Welcome to Handmade History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Alicia.
And I'm Sonia.
And today we are talking about Stumpwork. And this episode, we are also kicking off our first ever stitch along. We have collaborated with embroidery artist Melissa Galbraith of M Creative J to release the Wild Pansy Stumpwork Stitch Along and Kit. And if you are listening to this episode when it airs on March 3rd, 2026, today is our first day of the stitch along. So if you pre-ordered your kit or pattern, thank you. Grab your hoop and let's get stitching. And if you'd like to join in, you can still order the kit or pattern from M Creative J. We'll include a link in our show notes. Every week for the next 4 weeks, we'll post our progress on our Patreon page and on social media. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook. And you can comment on our posts there or share your own. Just use the hashtag StumpworkStitchalong and we'll find you. And you can find links to all our social media accounts on our website at handmadehistorypodcast.com. And if you're not interested in actually doing embroidery, but just want to listen to us chat about the history of Stumpwork, don't worry. That's what we're going to do for the rest of this episode. Sonia, want to kick us off?
So what is Stumpwork? Stumpwork is a special type of embroidery that incorporates three-dimensional elements. This means raised stitches, padded portions, or separate pieces of fabric that are embroidered and then sewn on. Stumpwork also often incorporates embellishments such as beads, sequins, buttons, and ribbons. Stumpwork has a long history, as we'll see. However, across time and place, it has a few common characteristics. The first is that it is dimensional. It uses padding, like we mentioned above. It also uses separate embroidered pieces to make your work literally pop. These pieces are called slips. Often they are stitched around wire.
Another common characteristic of Stumpwork is that it includes a lot of satin stitch. This is when you cover an area with long stitches. It's a technique that looks really smooth because it's so densely stitched. And modern machine embroidery uses a dense satin stitch to embroider logos on ball caps and tote bags. Satin stitch or long and short stitch were often used to thread paint. Thread painting is a modern term, but the concept is at least several hundred years old. And this is when you use a few different colors to make the work look lifelike. In our kit, you get to try thread painting like this on the pansy petals.
Another common trait is a wide variety of interesting dimensional stitches. This includes knots like French and bullion knots, stitches that imitate knitted garments, turkey work, which involves stitching big loops of thread and then trimming them, and couching, which is when you take a piece of thread, cord, or wire and tack it to your backing with another piece of thread using tiny stitches.
Stumpwork often depicts scenes, including people and things from nature, such as plants, animals, and even insects. The word stumpwork was not used until the early 1900s. It first appears in print in the writings of a textile expert named Mrs. R.E. Head. However, she doesn't claim to have coined this term. The word was also used in F&H Marshall's Old English Embroidery, published in 1894. Lady Marian Alford describes this type of embroidery in her book, Needlework as Art, published in 1886, as, quote, embroidery on the stamp. This refers to the fact that designs were drawn or stamped directly onto fabric. Other names for stumpwork include embossed work or raised work.
When you search for stumpwork, embroidery from a very specific era in England pops up. From the reign of James I through Charles II, the Stuart period, stumpwork was a very popular occupation of noble and royal women. At first, these women used stumpwork to decorate boxes, mirrors, and caskets. It was also used on book covers. We actually did an episode on a book artist from this time period, Esther Inglis. This is episode 20. She handwrote miniature manuscripts, and she sometimes embroidered their covers using stumpwork. Later on, people began to make standalone stumpwork scenes. The stumpwork from this time is also very specific in terms of subject matter. Mrs. Head, who we should note was an American, wrote that, quote, originality, it must be admitted, has never been a marked feature in English ornamental needlework. She later writes, quote, skillful adaptation, rather than invention, has distinguished its executants even when the art has been at its highest level in this country.
I feel like that was pretty sick burn.
Yeah. There are often scenes with people, typically members of the royal family. There are biblical scenes where sometimes the biblical characters look like members of the royal family.
There is also one scene that is repeated over and over again: a landscape with a castle, a sun behind clouds, a fish pond, birds, and oversized insects and flowers. Other common and strangely specific motifs include a seahorse fountain, kingfishers, which are a type of bird, and parrots. At this time, books of motifs were circulated, which helped spread and popularize particular images. There was Animalia, a book of beasts, birds, etc. by Thomas Johnson, which was published in 1630, and a book of curious and strange inventions called The First Part of Needleworks by William Barley, which was published in 1596. And you could also buy a kit to make a stumpwork project. For example, you might buy a kit to create an embellished mirror that would include all the materials you needed. And this was handy because of all the many threads and embellishments that stumpwork requires. The kit might also include the design already drawn or stamped onto the fabric for you. And I really like that the Stuarts had craft kits just like us, because craft kits really are so handy.
Yeah, I literally never thought about that. They would have them from like the Stuart era.
Yeah.
But I definitely always think of them as a modern thing. That's fun.
Nope, Stuarts had them first.
Around this time, steel needles became easier to obtain in England. Prior to that, steel needles had to be imported from Spain. Steel needles were much easier to use than the more common bronze needles. This better tool probably contributed to stumpwork's popularity. Stuart embroiderers often used silk and metal thread, especially gold. They also used a variety of other embellishments. Pearls were very common. Esther Inglis's books had hundreds of tiny pearls on them. Artists also used strips of metal, pieces of mica, which is a flaky, translucent stone. This was used to make windows in the castles, for example. They used bits of coral, carved wood and ivory. Chenille, which is a fuzzy fabric, was used for grass, and they also used sequins. Finally, embroidery artists used a material called purl, spelled P-U-R-L. This is a fine wire wrapped in silk thread. You then wrap the covered wire around a very thin needle and sewed this onto the seam. It was used to add texture to natural things like rocks and trees. You actually need a magnifying glass to see pearl.
The people in Stuart embroideries look like dolls. They and their surroundings have incredible detail. In one, a man's hat actually casts a shadow over his face. In another, doors open, and you can pull curtains aside. I actually saw a stumpwork portrait of Charles I where his lace collar was miniature needle lace, and it's even believed that his own hair was woven into his hair in that portrait. To quote our grandmother Becky, the stumpwork from this time period is very collectible. If you search stumpwork embroidery, you'll find a clip from the show Antiques Roadshow, where someone finds out that their mother's 300-year-old stumpwork scene is worth $8,000. However, stumpwork was not limited to this time period.
Embroidery was a common activity in England in the preceding era, the Tudor era, as well. Queen Elizabeth loved embroidery. She was very skilled and she did stumpwork. In a great book by Thomasina Beck called The Embroiderer's Story, there is a book cover that Elizabeth embroidered. It has a large layered motif of letters that are padded and covered with beads. There are also puffy flowers in the four corners of the cover. Elizabeth made this cover in 1545 before she became queen. Elizabeth also loved to wear dresses that were covered in an all-over floral print that was hand-embroidered. In the generation before, Catherine Parr, one of the wives of Henry VIII, was also a skilled embroiderer. She decorated the cover of a book of prayers with a similar design to Elizabeth's. The letters on her cover use an embroidery stitch that look almost knitted. Again, the letters are layered and make a very interesting and elaborate motif.
Prior to the Tudor time period, I stumbled upon an example of stumpwork described in a book of poems written in 1450. And I'm going to go down a brief sidetrack about flowers because I thought this was really cool. The stumpwork pattern and kit that we collaborated on with M Creative J is of a pansy. And I decided to research pansies to include as part of our article, which is in the kit. So I looked up pansy on the Oxford English Dictionary and discovered that the first use of the word appears in a poem written by Charles d'Orleans. D'Orleans was a duke and a poet, and he wrote in French and in Middle English. This book is in Middle English, and it was published in 1450. It's just called Poems. And I did a little searching and found a copy of the text in the original. It's a very long poem, an epic, and here is the part that mentions pansies. The lining of hit was with knittle wrought, so plain, so thick, so smooth, so prettily, with little flowers soft, the sovereign and the daisy, but most of pansy might I spy. I included this poem in the article, and you can also read it in our show notes because seeing the Middle English is entertaining. It sounds like modern English, but the spelling is wildly different. So interestingly, this verse talks about the lining of a mantle, which is described in the previous verse. A mantle is a sleeveless cloak that women wore over a dress. And the lines with knittle wrought mean with needle wrought, in other words, embroidered. So the very first use of the word pansy is to describe an embroidered pansy. And what some of you are doing right now is embroidering a pansy. But wait, there is even more. The verse before this one describes the outside of the mantle. The outside is decorated very lavishly also with roses that are intertwined. These roses are described as being embellished with stones, and they are covered in pearls. And some are loose or dangling, and others are fast or attached. So I think that this is a stumpwork mantle, and the pansies could very well also be stumpwork pansies.
That's very cool.
Isn't that so fun?
So the English definitely created their own style of stumpwork. However, many of the characteristics of stumpwork are seen in Byzantine embroidery. We have mentioned the Byzantines before. They were part of our episode on the Silk Roads, episode 12. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian is said to have obtained the secrets of sericulture or silk making in the 500s. Byzantine embroidery used a lot of silk threads and was often done on red silk. Byzantine embroidery shares a lot of the same traits as stumpwork. It used gold and silver thread, for example. It showed scenes, especially biblical scenes. This is because many of the embroidered textiles were used in church settings. Like Stuart stumpwork, Byzantine embroidery was used to decorate objects, especially boxes, including caskets.
Yes, I saw an example that had been made in 1300 of a box showing images of Jesus and his disciples.
Byzantine embroidery often included animals, both real and imaginary, such as lions and griffins. They also used beads, especially pearls, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. The Byzantine stitch, which is still used today, refers to metal wires that are couched with silk thread. This was used to cover backgrounds and to outline halos and garments in Byzantine embroidery and seems like a precursor or perhaps a different version of pearl. The Byzantines also did thread painting with their many colored silks. In some Byzantine textiles, researchers note, quote, the embroiderer's needle rivaled the painter's brush.
It makes sense that the techniques used in Byzantine embroidery would travel from this part of the world to England around the 1300s or even earlier. They could have been passed along by travelers on the Silk Roads. People traded not only in textiles along these roads, but also in ideas. And embroidery is pretty special in that you can look at the finished piece and figure out how to make the stitch. I thought we would take a brief sidetrack and look at a specific example of Byzantine embroidery. I found one that dated to the late 1300s of a double-headed eagle, and a lot of the following comes from an excellent paper by Jennifer Ball. The double-headed eagle was a secular symbol. It might refer to an empire that looks both east and west. But secular symbols like this one and other ones were used for religious purposes. This particular one might have been on an altar cloth. It included couch stitches or Byzantine stitch that added dimensionality to the image. This one does not have the kind of puffy dimensional details that are found in stumpwork, but it was stitched on linen and paper. There was also an inscribed medallion showing that the textile belonged to Paul, Patriarch of Constantinople and New Rome. Jennifer Ball posited that this textile belonged to a particular Paul who pretended to be a patriarch, which is an upper-level cleric, and elaborate textiles like this one might have helped him play the role. So I thought that was kind of fun. Like if you have the fancy enough textiles, people will believe that you have also this high role in the church.
Yeah, using it to defraud people.
Yeah.
Crazy.
You never know what embroidery could do.
Mm-hmm. Going back a few hundred years earlier to the 700s, people embroidered icons. Icons are images of religious figures, such as people from the Bible, as well as saints. They were very popular in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Icons could be made in many forms, including mosaics and paintings, and they could also be embroidered. Interestingly, it was very common to stitch pearls around the religious icons, outlining their halos, for example. The beads made the icons easier to see.
There was a dispute going back to the very beginnings of Christianity about the creation of icons, and this is called the iconoclastic controversy. It is the origin of the word iconoclast. Iconoclasts said that making and venerating or worshiping icons was wrong. People who made icons argued that divinity could be found in matter as well, not just the spiritual plane. And the iconoclasts persecuted the icon makers. This actually may have helped spread embroidery techniques. In 730, the Emperor Leo III banned icon veneration. The next emperor, Constantine V, persecuted icon worshippers mercilessly. Tradition holds that during this time, a group of nuns fled Constantinople and were taken in by a church in Rome, and that these nuns embroidered textiles for the Roman Church. This church still has the nun's icon of Saint Mary, which, although it isn't embroidered, is very beautiful. And because icons used beads, I wonder if these nuns or other people who embroidered icons brought that tradition with them when they left the eastern part of the Roman Empire and headed west. The iconoclastic controversy ended when Empress Theodora made icon veneration legal in 843, and this is still celebrated in the Orthodox Christian Church as the Feast of Orthodoxy. However, embroidery is done all over the world. Like knoll binding or tie-dye, you can find it everywhere. Some of these traditions migrated from place to place, and some were spontaneously invented. It seems to be a part of human nature to decorate with thread.
Now we'll switch gears and talk about stumpwork in the Americas. In Peru, embroidered textiles have been found that date between 500 and 100 BCE. For example, one panel shows a figure that is part man, part mythical creature, dancing. It used the split stitch and was made with wool on cotton backing. The skill used to create this image shows that this was not new technology. Stumpwork was done in other parts of Europe before it reached England, and one of those places was Spain. Stumpwork traveled with the Spaniards to Mexico, as well as Central and South America in the 1500s and 1600s. It was used by the Spanish colonists in church settings. In Mexico, a sampler from the late 1700s made on linen with silk and gold thread included many of the elements of stumpwork, such as couching, long and short stitch, and French knots. It was decorated with spangles, which are like big metal sequins, and it depicted animals, including birds and a rabbit, as well as butterflies and flowers.
Elements of stumpwork were also incorporated into clothing. In some countries, people wear mantas or cloaks, which are embroidered and very beautiful. And manta, which is a Spanish word, reminded me of the mantle with the pansy lining that we talked about. Mantas are worn in some parts of Peru on festival days. These festive mantas show scenes from history, mythology, and even comic books. They also show birds and flowers. They are made from cotton and velvet, and they use silk and metallic thread. They are embellished with beads, braid, sequins, and mirrors. They also have stuffed elements, which in Spanish is called alto relieve.
In the 1960s, a woman named Elisa Hirsch-Maya, known as Madame Maya, innovated stumpwork and created a style we now call Brazilian embroidery. Madame Maya created stumpwork, especially of flowers, using knots and wire to make the elements 3D. But instead of using silk thread, she used rayon thread. Rayon thread is very shiny. She also dyed her own colors and made brighter colors. She started her own company, Vericore, to manufacture threads. One of their most popular types of thread was variegated. And in Brazil, people call any type of variegated thread Vericore. Brazilian embroidery is popular for decorated home goods such as pillows.
And stumpwork is having a moment in modern crafting today. It doesn't generally include people anymore, but embroiderers still stitch plenty of nature motifs, especially flowers and plants. It's a flexible and interesting art form, and it can be used to make art and home decor. And that is a brief tour of stumpwork. Sonia, what do you think?
I thought that was fun. We talked about, I do like cross stitch and everything, but I've never really done any work with stumpwork, and I didn't know much about it, so that's really cool.
Yes. I am very excited to try it out after learning about how old it is. And I'm also really excited to stitch a pansy because that was the first pansy ever mentioned was a stumpwork pansy.
That's cool.
Super fun.
Also, the tutor's back again. Always there.
The tutors are everywhere. Can't escape them. Well, thank you so much for listening. For those of you who are joining us for the M Creative J Wild Pansy Stumpwork Stitch Along, thank you for stitching along with us. We will see you on Patreon and/or social media over the next few weeks. And if you are inspired by what you learned about in today's episode and wish to buy your own pattern or kit, just like the Stuarts did, you can find the link to buy your own in our show notes. You can also buy a PDF of the pattern and join in with your own thread.
You can find out more on patreon.com/handmadehistorypodcast. If you have a question or comment, you can email us at handmadehistoryhosts, that's HOSTS, @gmail.com, or visit our website at handmadehistorypodcast.com.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
There's no hard words. There was one hard word.